Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw, coming to you from the CHEK News World Headquarters here in Victoria. Lots to get to this week. We have the return of masks and vaccines. The legislature is about to start up again. We've got some new deficit projections, housing targets, polling numbers, lots of things. Make sure you subscribe to the audio podcast for extra discussion this week. To break it all down, we are going to bring in the pod squad, Allie Blades, Jeff Ferrier, and Jillian Oliver. Thank you all for being here. Jeff, we should just note off the top, you got a new title here, founding partner at FramePoint Public Affairs and associate at Hill & Knowlton. So congratulations on that change of title for you.
It's exciting and glad to start off not talking about the lack of facial hair.
Yeah, new beard, new job. We'll see what the third thing is next week. Probably a puppy. A new puppy for Jeff. He's in the market for a puppy. Anyways.
I've got two already. I've got two.
Okay, well, third. We will start with something else that's new this week, masks and vaccines. The province bringing back mandatory masks inside hospitals, long-term care homes, mental health care facilities, also launching its fall vaccine campaign, urging people to get both the COVID booster, the flu vaccine, prevent our healthcare system perpetually teetering on the brink from being overwhelmed this fall. One thing that is not changing, though, the mandatory vaccine requirement for healthcare workers like nurses. We're still the only province with that. It's kind of hard to explain. If you got the first two shots back in 2020 and 2021, you're good. You don't even have to get the booster this fall, but a new healthcare worker would have to get the booster before they're allowed to work. So lots to digest there. Jillian, you want to start us off? What jumps out at you? How feasible is this plan with the public, and what do you think? How do you think it's going to go over?
Well, I think the masks thing makes sense. Lots of people are sick right now. To be honest, I think that it always probably makes sense to have an extra layer of protection in places where there's lots of medically vulnerable people. So I think that's a good thing, and I don't expect it'll be terribly controversial, at least I hope not. I think on the vaccine mandate, it is a little perplexing that we're the only province still left with this. Henry, when she was asked about this week, said that 99% of healthcare workers are already covered under the mandate, so it's not really having that big of an impact. We've got widespread protection. But we heard from some smaller communities, like the Mayor of Smithers, saying that in their community, this means that one doctor is out, then another doctor has 2,000 patients, and we have to, I think, start asking what are sort of the downstream effects. I don't know why a doctor or a nurse wouldn't be vaccinated, but I think that when people lose access to primary care and we have a crisis in our system, we start to see those knock-on effects down the road, more people in hospital if they can't access primary care and that sort of a thing. So I think at the very least, it would be good to have an explanation with measurable outcomes for why we're the only province that's kind of an outlier here. Yeah,
it's a great question. We don't really deal with it in urban British Columbia as much, but in rural BC, you're left with that question, as you point out, would it be better to have that local ER open rather than driving 3 hours to have vaccinated staff if you could be seen by unvaccinated staff in a more timely manner? That push and pull is not an issue that's being debated in urban BC, but a huge consequence in rural BC. Jeff, does the vaccine mandate and all of this still make sense to you? Do you think we're going to see compliance?
Boy, I'm having flashbacks to when I was working in the Ministry of Health and doing that stuff, and I remember those briefings that we've all blacked out and
right.
just pushed to the back of our heads like
Call
they
them the
never
before
happened.
Times.
Before times. It was COVID's always going to be with us, and it's going to be with us for a long time, and we need to adapt and be ready when it's back. And it's back, right? It's cases are up. Absenteeism, due to illness in healthcare settings, is up appreciably this fall. And so the government has a responsibility, public health has a responsibility to make sure that we have the health workers we need in our healthcare system, in our ERs, in our surgery wards, so that people can get the care they need. and insisting on wearing masks and on vaccination of health workers, to me, seems like a sensible, evidence-based approach. And, I understand the frustration that folks in some of those smaller centers are feeling, and everyone wants to have as many health workers in our ERs, in our hospitals, providing care. The challenge is that when health workers are unvaccinated and they're introduced into settings where they can spread the virus to other health workers or to those who are facing, at greater risk of severe illnesses and infections, it's really problematic. And you balance the risk and the reward, and I'm good with where the province and Dr. Henry have landed.
I'm still not totally sure, and I'm not a doctor, none of us are doctors, if you're unvaccinated, do you spread the virus more than a vaccinated person? I guess that's a core question that I'm still not clear about, having sat through, like a 2-hour briefing this week that we'll try to follow up on, because, it's all about helping to ensure the safety of the most elderly and the youngest who are most at risk. And so we should be doing whatever that is. But Allie, there's a new survey out by the Canadian Association of Pharmacists who are going to be administering all this, saying 35% of Canadians don't intend to get their COVID vaccine this fall. So that might be a worrying number for the government, who's clearly hoping that we're going to get better uptake than some of the boosters have been, which have probably been pretty low. Is it realistic to expect people are going to want to get the vaccine this fall, do you think?
Well, a couple of things are going to happen. I think, like we've seen in previous years, and then especially at the height of the pandemic, there will be a large campaign funded by the government to try to encourage the vaccine. But then it gets into the political hotbed of the conversation, and we really can't talk about this without talking about the political nuance of this. And so far, the only political party provincially that has come out to say anything against this was the BC Conservatives and John Rustad as leader, and saying that he wouldn't really stand for the mask mandate and the vaccine. He was disappointed, I guess, in the vaccine rules for healthcare professionals based on a lot of the issues that Jillian she mentioned. Now, I know that there's a lot of much smarter people than I in this whole situation, but I've never really understood why, I haven't been to my doctor's physical office in years. Why can't those who choose for various reasons not to get the vaccine essentially do a work from home model like we've done with pretty much every other industry? And that's the innovation that I think we're missing in a solution to this potential problem, because we've already lost those healthcare professionals. So can we bring them back with being an innovator in how we combat this issue and come up with a little bit of a compromise? I'm sure there's a good reason as to why that hasn't happened already, and this is just a pie in the sky idea, but I want to know.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep an eye on this one, because this discussion is the beginning of what's going to be months of discussion about whether BC's healthcare system can handle both a flu season, a resurgence of COVID, the chronic understaffing it already has, and hours and hours long lineups and horror stories at emergency rooms and closures across the province. So this is the beginning of that discussion, which I'm sure we will keep having. Another discussion that we have had for a while now is on housing, and the BC government finally unveiling targets for municipalities on its so-called housing naughty list. The NDP hates that term, but that's what it is. 10 municipalities, you have Vancouver and Oak Bay and Victoria, Kamloops, several other in the Lower Mainland, given targets to build over the next 5 years, and a breakdown of how many bedrooms and size and below market and rentals and that type of thing. So it'll mean different things. Some municipalities have to triple their output. Some are kind of already on the right path. Is this doable? The Premier is saying no excuses. Allie, let's stick with you on that. Are the housing targets, do they make sense? Are they political theater? Are they all of the above? What did you make of this?
It's a bit of a combination of the political theater and trying to come up with a solution, because we really need to try everything and anything to fix this issue. The way that I see it, I'm a fair person. The NDP aren't completely to blame for everything under the sun, including housing. And one of the things that it's more of a systematic issue that we all have to deal with is just interest rates, the rising cost of construction, supply issues. Those are all things that I'm sure they're all working on, but they can't fix tomorrow. So there's that component. But on the political theater side, this is a bit of a shield, and I've said this before, this is a bit of a shield, because then if this doesn't necessarily go the way that we want it to in solutions oriented, then they get to point the finger at the municipality. And so I'm really hoping then that the municipalities then push back to say, okay, well then you came up with the structure and the proposal. Let's make sure that I then have the funding allocated to be able to do this. And Ravi Kahlon, the minister, has very much said that this is in partnership and that we're going to do this together. Well, then his responsibility is to ensure that the funding is going to be available when the municipality asks for it. And then if he doesn't, it's up to the municipality to say, okay, well, I tried. I mean, I guess that's the whole point of it all. But I caution the viewers and the listeners that this could very well end up being a shield to a larger issue for them.
Mm-hmm. The Premier was in Ottawa this week trying to extract more money on housing for those very issues, infrastructure for municipalities. Those municipalities say they don't have the planning staff and the capacity to kind of handle this. Jeff, the timelines that are laid out here, it seems unlikely we are going to see the NDP government steamroll a municipality before the next election in October of 2024 based on these sort of timelines. So I guess in that way, they're more of a threat than an actual kind of discipline before voters go to the polls. But what did you make of this?
Well, yeah, and that depends on how the local governments who are in not the naughty list report, they don't like the name, but too bad, it's what it is, how those folks react. And we'll see. Most of the response we're hearing back from those local governments is positive and constructive, and so hopefully that keeps up. What I found interesting about this week is it seems to me that there are two Canadian politicians who really get the housing issue, and it's David Eby and Pierre Poilievre. And I hear from both get the raw emotion, kind of the frustration that people are feeling. That folks want less no because of this and more of the yes we must because of that. And I think the important political takeaway that is being heard around city halls across the province and local government buildings is stop complaining about view corridors and focusing on changing neighborhood character and how there's not enough parking on the street and all the other excuses that stymie attempts to get housing approved by local governments. It's a housing crisis. People on the edge are having a hard time affording their mortgages and rent. If they have a place, build everywhere, make it affordable, make it for families, get it done. Get it done. You've got your targets. Make it happen, and if you won't, make way for someone who will. So. And I just want to say it's always a good show when Allie says that you can't blame the BC NDP for absolutely everything under the sun.
That's a good clip. We'll keep that clip handy. Jillian, what do you think?
I mean, I think it's always government targets are often aspirational. We could go run a whole list of targets that the government hasn't met, whether it's climate or poverty reduction. What really matters is the funding and the implementation details. And I think when we get into some of the barriers to implementation that Allie and Jeff were talking about, this is going to get sticky. On the one hand, this is a fraction of what's needed. We're increasing our population by hundreds of thousands of people every year. And this is a list for 60,000 units over 5 years. So it's not nearly enough. But at the same time, I think it's going to be challenging for some of the local governments to meet. One of the biggest things is the more that we build, the higher the cost of construction gets. And so it is in itself kind of adding to the inflationary pressures that the housing sector is facing at a time where we're already seeing housing starts down in the fiscal update because of rising interest rates. So it's very complex. That's why you see this sort of jockeying for responsibility responsibility and, pointing fingers for resources between different levels of governments. I do think the province is trying to step up with some money for infrastructure. They're creating a land bank so that they can kind of say, here you go, local governments, here's where you can build, because land is in a lot of cases one of the biggest costs. So I do think that they are trying to put in some concrete resources to get this done. But I think, it's going to be really interesting to see how all levels of government navigate the details of this to try to reach those targets.
Yeah, those are excellent points. And I think, for a lot of folks, their main question to this comes down to, well, if government succeeds here, does the price of anything go down? The price of my rent or the price of buying a place? The answer to that is probably no. Jillian, as you pointed out, it's a fraction of the demand. But when the government was asked that this week, Housing Minister Ravi Kahlon and Premier David Eby point to next year's BC Builds plan, which I think is government building affordable housing, which is this multi-billion-dollar thing that we haven't quite wrapped our heads around yet, building affordable housing and offering it at below market rents and sales that may be the kind of other middle point of this in terms of actually doing something about pricing too. The government has a lot on its plate with housing, which actually brings us to the next topic, which is the legislature returning Tuesday for the fall session. We know that I think there's like 4 or 5 bills on housing. There's secondary suites being allowed province-wide. There's the 4-unit missing middle strategy on single-family lots. There's the zoning around transit hubs for density, and the reform to the residential tenancy branch, regulations on short-term rentals. Like, it's a giant package of housing. Plus, they've got decrim changes on public drug use at playgrounds, emergency management legislation. It goes on and on. Plus, we got 4 parties now. The officially recognized BC Conservatives. We haven't seen 4 official parties since I think the 1950s. It's going to be fascinating. I think, Jeff. All that housing, I guess, is we're going to be talking about it the entire fall.
Look, first of all, I want to get CHEK to go back to your 1950s TV coverage of the 4 parties in the Legislative Assembly. I think that'd be
be really a guy who looks just like me with like a bowler hat on, smoking a cigarette probably at the anchor desk. But anyways,
in beautiful black and white, that'd be great. Look, if you take a step back, look, I expect it's going to be an exciting and unpredictable fall at the legislature. Because with the election just a year away, time's running out on everyone and everything. So you've really laid out, the premier and government needing to show progress on their big priorities. And so they're going to be pushing out announcements, driving legislation, because they need to make progress on core issues that we've been talking about on the show today: housing, healthcare, and affordability and climate that we talk about an awful lot. And you got the opposition parties off on the other side, fighting one another over who's the real conservative party, with a short window to establish who's the real right-wing alternative to the NDP. You've got the Greens, who are going to be fighting, as they always do, to make their points. And everyone else involved in this too. It's not just the parties. There's local governments, there's Indigenous nations, there's businesses, unions, institutions, environmentalists, community organizers all over the place. And they're seeing the window close on their time to influence government in getting things done that they want, because electioneering kind of grinds the governing to a fault. So there's this real big amount of pressure applied on everyone. And with time slipping away, and the more pressure you have, and the more politicians and interest groups feel like that ability to get done what they want to get done is slipping beyond their grasp, the more likely they are to do big, bold things and take risks. So I think we're going to have lots of interesting things to talk about on this show in the weeks ahead.
Mm-hmm. Great points, yeah. And if you want to get into the provincial budget, which is in February, your time to influence that and squeeze some money out of that is closing rapidly this fall too. Allie, what do you think about the fall session and what we should be looking for there?
It is very much going to be ideas driven. It's going to be very policy focused, because we have so many issues that we need to fix. But I think, we're going to get into this conversation a little bit more on the podcast side of the political nuance of what's happening with the opposition and all of that fun stuff. But here's what I think, and with a lot of scientific data to back it up here. Because Kevin Falcon and BC United have put forward so many policy ideas, they're not necessarily playing the opposition game as like as traditionally has been done before. What I mean by this is the fact that like they've put out so many things that are teasers to their election platform that typically opposition doesn't do until the election period. They wait till months before election day to put out their ideas. Not Kevin Falcon. He's like, no, I've heard from people that they want to hear an alternative solution. Therefore, he put out, the Better BC, the Better is Possible plan, the Safer plan, something to combat wildfires. I'm confident that the next thing has to be housing because people want to know, well, what they are going to do. And isn't that the criticism for most people when talking about the opposition is like that they continue to hear, well, what are you going to do about it? I hear you complaining about it, but what are you going to do about it? Well, Kevin Falcon and his team have actually said, well, here's what we're going to do about it. And it's a refreshing spin on what opposition typically does, which is just, point the finger and say you're wrong.
That's true. It gives them solutions to talk about in the House for sure. Jillian, what are you watching for?
Well, I think certainly the dynamic between the BC Conservatives and BC United is going to be interesting. Are they going to sort of play to what the NDP is hoping, that it's going to be a race to the bottom of right-wing policies, or are they going to kind of try to brand themselves as a little bit more moderate? This is really crunch time for them to brand themselves and tell voters who they are, because they're running out of time. And I think, like Allie said, they've come up with some policies, but I think, in terms of a brand and a sort of coherent identity, they're a little bit all over the place. The public safety stuff is quite right-wing, and some of the other things might be, seen as a little bit more moderate or pragmatic. So it's going to be interesting to see if they can really focus and come up with a clear identity, or if they continue to sort of waffle and fall into the trap that we've seen sort of past conservative federal leaders fall into, where they try to be too many things and nobody kind of ends up being able to trust them or know who they are. And I think also crunch time for the Greens. They really need to refine their value proposition for voters and differentiate from the government and start to sort of refine that election message as we get closer to the election next year.
Yeah, be a fascinating session, and we'll be here each and every week to walk you through all the stuff that is happening. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube, check in on CHEK, use the CHEK Plus app, and also subscribe to the audio podcast. Thank you to the Pod Squad for being here. Thank you for watching. We'll be back next week with all the latest here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.